Our guest on today's episode is Dr. David Sinclair. David is a professor of genetics at the Harvard Medical School, as well as a world-renowned researcher. He's published over 200 scientific papers focusing on a variety of topics, from metabolic diseases to inflammation, infectious disease, and important for our conversation today, aging and reversing aging. What I always appreciate most about my conversations with David is his unique ability to simplify these complex concepts in a way that's easy for everyone to understand. In our discussion today, we focus on the types of food David believes we should all be eating, how to time your food intake, and the importance of sleep and your circadian rhythm. Very, very important topics, especially sleep. I think something everyone will really enjoy hearing more about. In the conversation today, we also talk very much about how we can slow down the rate of diseases and prolong the health span of our lives. One of the fascinating things to me about this conversation is thinking about aging as a disease, not a state. This is really David's specialty, and there's so much to learn from him. And as you'll hear, he's pushing the boundaries now and trying to explore actually reversing aging. Very excited for you all to listen to my conversation with Dr. Sinclair, and I hope you find it to be as helpful and informative as I did. Well, David Sinclair, welcome to the Keep Going podcast. Happy to have you with us here today.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's great. Well, look, you've been very public in the last couple of years since the release of your book, and so we're thrilled to have you on today. I thought for our listeners who are intensely interested in all things performance recovery and especially aging and longevity, with Tom playing the way he's playing in his professional career, that we could maybe start a little bit of this conversation with how you first got interested in researching aging and longevity and its causes and effects.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I really think about it, it's two issues that I have. One is that my grandmother told me about aging and death at a young age, which I think most of us go through, but we forget about it. We try to ignore aging and death, otherwise it's crippling. For me, that still is a shock to realize that everyone we love and all of our friends, will suffer presumably at the end of life. So that's the one thing. There's that morbidity that I keep thinking about. The second thing, John, is that I have this mind that likes to look at things differently. It's just the way I'm born, and so I like to take things that seem obvious and look at them from behind and realize, hang on, that's not the way we look at, or we should look at things. And aging is one of those things where I can remember my teenage years thinking, why do we accept this? Why are we okay with aging, which is the root cause of most of the suffering in the world, but we're not okay with cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's? And I didn't have a good answer for that. I thought it was crazy that we just accept this thing we call aging. Aging, by the way, we give it a name, but all it is it's the deterioration of the body. And when you put it that way, you think, well, that's something we should try to figure out. Why do we deteriorate over time? And what leads to all of these diseases in the first place? It's aging. And so, in college, I decided I was going to try to see if I could do something to understand why we age. And maybe in my lifetime, we could even do something about it.
Yeah, and it's pretty incredible because you've spent the better part of your career now investigating this, and you've made great headways in understanding why we age. And, as you pose the question to yourself, I'll pose it to you now for our listeners. Why do we age?
Well, so it's not fully agreed upon yet. We're still early 20th century physics kind of stuff, where we think we know there's atoms and we know there's particles. The details will be argued over. There are about 9 major causes of aging that my colleagues and I have helped identify. Many of them you've probably heard of. There's the loss of stem cells, there's telomere shortening, which is the ends of chromosomes getting short. There's nutrient deregulation, so you don't respond well to nutrients and sugar. There's mitochondrial dysfunction, so the power packs of our cells decline. But there's one thing that I think may be a major cause and drive many of these other changes, and that's the loss of information in our cells. And you might say, well, what do I mean by information? Well, it's pretty simple. There's only two types of information in the cell that last our lifetime. One is the DNA, the genome, and the other, which we don't talk about as much, but is just as important for health, that's the epigenome. And that's the information that tells the genome how to behave, that tells a cell to be a skin cell or a brain cell, and to stay that way for 100, up to 120 years. And I think, and we have some evidence from the lab, that it's the loss of the epigenome information, epigenetic information, that is a root cause of aging. And part of the evidence is that in my lab, we can play with the epigenome in cells and in mice, and we can accelerate aging. And just recently we've published, we can reverse it as well.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And I think as you've described it to me before, it's this information theory of aging. I think for those people who may be less scientific listening, I know you have an amazing analogy, which I think really resonates. And you talk about a CD and scratches on a CD. Could you share with us a little bit more about that? I think for some of our audience, they may never have seen a CD at a certain age group, but for a few of us, we're very familiar with them, even back to cassettes and VHSs. But let's talk about a CD and using that as an example.
Right. Yeah. Our son got a CD yesterday to put in his computer, and he said, "My computer doesn't have a CD."
That's right.
What is this thing?
I haven't seen a CD in probably 10 years, I don't think. Yeah.
No, actually, kids of that age, teenagers, think it's bizarre that you can actually hold music in your hands. But yeah, so the analogy is that the genome, the DNA, is the music that's etched into the silver, and the epigenome is the reader that plays the right songs, or in our cells, the right genes at the right time. And we start off with a beautiful CD player. I mean, it's working beautifully. We can read the music. We hear a beautiful symphony or rap songs, whatever your cell is into. But over time, those scratches accumulate on the CD, and you get skipping. And eventually, it doesn't even play. And that's what we think is happening in the cell. But it's not the DVD or the CD player that's getting disrupted. It's the structures that control how genes are read or switched off, on and off switches. And, again, if you haven't thought about biology for a while, these on and off switches are pretty simple. There are loops of DNA where genes get switched on, and there are bundles of DNA where genes are kept in an off state for many, many years. In fact, sometimes for a lifetime. And it's those loops of DNA and bundles that determines the health of a cell that we see are disrupted during aging, the equivalent of the scratches on the CD. And we were asking essentially, what scratches the CD, and can you polish the CD to get the music back?
It's incredible. Yeah, we'll come back to the polishing in a little bit, because that's where the reversal, I think, at some level comes in. But when you talk about scratching the CD and you talk about disrupting the information, this epigenetic information, in your research and your experience, what are some of the factors to disrupting that information? Especially, I think, for our listeners, lifestyle related ones would be very interesting to learn about.
Right. Well, we started studying aging in yeast cells. I was over at MIT, and this is going back to 1999. We found that a major disruptor of the epigenome, the scratches, come from DNA damage. And it's not the mutations that are the biggest problem. You probably remember the big theory of aging, and you'll still hear people talk about it at parties. But mutations themselves, I don't think, is a main driver of aging. They do occur, but what happens is when you have a DNA damage occurrence in the cell, particularly a broken piece of DNA, this is really quite a stress on the cell. what the cell needs to do is to take proteins from certain genes that are switched off and should remain off, but it takes those same proteins and uses them to repair the DNA. And then they have to go back to where they came from. And so during the day, we're having a number of breaks in every cell. So that's 26 trillion plus breaks in chromosomes every day in our body. The proteins, which I'm showing as my fists, leave their sites, go to repair, and then go back. And it's a game of ping pong during our whole lives. But what we find is they don't always go back to the same place. And over time,
So this break repair is happening all day, every day at the cellular level. Yeah.
Right. But the reset is not 100%. And one analogy would be when FEMA went and the Corps of Engineers, Corps of Civil Engineers went down to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and they helped repair the dikes and the houses, but only 99% of them went back home. And there's 1% of houses in the US where the weeds are growing and the male's accumulating. And if you do have multiple hurricanes every day, you're going to have a real mess of the country by the end of a few decades.
Yeah. And if anyone's ever been involved in manufacturing anything or making anything, if you do it 100 times and something breaks, for sure you're not going to have 100% success rate fixing it, not to mention 26 trillion times a day at the cellular level. So now you have things they don't reset right. What happens in the body? Like what's the response? Is this when the aging process starts, or when body systems start breaking down, or health issues, or what happens next for those of us that are not, cellular biologists, if you will?
Yeah. So in the beginning, when we're in our 20s, there's not enough of that to really be noticeable health-wise. We're still peaking. Many athletes will peak even later. But you're still aging, right? And we actually know this because you can measure biological age now, and you can measure a particular control system for the epigenome. It's known as DNA methylation, and that's just a technical word for a chemical that sticks to DNA. That's required to maintain those loops, and in particular those bundles. And it's a permanent chemical change, or relatively permanent. But unfortunately, during this process of DNA repair and return of the proteins, for reasons we don't fully understand, those DNA methylation marks, which you can think of as a plaque that is on your teeth, it can accumulate. We see more and more of this methylation over time on our DNA, and we can measure that and plug it into a computer, and it'll tell us what our biological age is within about 5% error. And what we know from looking at thousands of people is the following: that it's very accurate, that it can predict how long you're going to live and how healthy you'll be in the future. And getting back to your question about what you can do, if you do the right things, which is maintain, exercise throughout your life, don't smoke, don't overeat, don't become obese. Those are the main things. You can actually slow down the rate that clock ticks over. And so that's how we know that we're accelerating aging in these mice, and how we can actually reverse it. But what we also see as the clock ticks over is a decline in cells' ability to function. Certain genes come on that have no business being on in an adult organism, such as developmental genes that should only be on in the embryo. And then cells, depends on the cell type. Skin cells start to lose their ability to divide. Nerve cells lose the ability to fire the electrical signals, and you get dysfunction. For instance, we don't see as well at night. That's an example of what happens over time. But eventually, you can have blindness. And that's just one example, of course. And that's what I think really is driving most of the diseases and the suffering on this planet.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's almost as you describe it, David. It's almost like aging is a disease. Am I out of bounds in saying that, or is it different?
Not in my book, but literally not in my book.
That's right. Which I have read. So that was a little bit of a loaded question, but yes.
So it's important to consider that the difference between a disease and aging It's a fine line. In fact, if you look up a medical dictionary and look at the definition of a disease, it's a process that leads over time to deterioration, loss of function, and often death. Conversely, well, if you look up aging, it's exactly the same thing. The only difference that separates the two is that a disease happens to less than half the population and aging happens to more than 50%, which I think is a silly distinction. In fact, it's missing the main point that aging itself is what drives most of the diseases that we get as we get older: cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, frailty. The root cause, it's not, if you smoke, for example, you increase your chance of lung cancer by 5-fold. Aging from the age of 20 to 70 increases it more than 100-fold. And so aging is the biggest risk factor by far for cancer and these other ailments.
Yeah. And so when you talk about, just going back to your example before, you talk about things like smoking as an example. I guess for those less scientific people out there, the smoking is effectively scratching the CD.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what we see. So that clock we can use to measure the scratches. Exactly. You do see that people who have smoked on average are biologically older. And one of the reasons, I believe, is because you're creating more DNA damage. There are chemicals in smoke as well as in plastics, and UV rays will do the same kind of thing. Will damage the DNA, accelerate those, what we call gene expression changes, or the epigenetic changes that lead to aging, we believe.
Yeah, and so it's easy to think about things like smoking or drinking or eating fast food as, very clear things that are doing damage. We can talk more about what are the things that can potentially do damage, but we always at TB12 like to talk about the positive opportunity for people to impact their health. So assuming I'm not a smoker, which I'm not, never have been, like you, I like to exercise, but what are some of the other things you have found from a lifestyle standpoint, choices that people can make to have a positive influence on this aging process?
You're right. So all of my statements are based on evidence, okay? Because the aging field is full of people who just make stuff up. Well, not the aging field, but people who make recommendations. So I applaud what you do, John. It's all based in science. So I preface that because I want to say that there are two ways of approaching trying to understand what we should do in our lives. One is mainly what I do, which is studying animals and yeast cells and even worms to see what makes them tick and learn from them. The other way is to look at what people who live healthy and a long time are doing on average. And actually, we've met in the middle now. Our fields agree that the type of foods, and in particular, when you eat, is very important for slowing down the aging process. And so if there was one thing I could recommend besides exercise, it would be to eat less often. And that's what I do in my life. I skip at least one meal a day, drink tea or coffee just to try and take my mind off it. You do get used to it.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of evidence that will forestall the effects of aging later in life.
I'm glad you said that, because I actually I do take your advice very often. I've been very fortunate to get to know you, and obviously you've read your book. But I had my first meal today at probably 12:30. The only thing I had before that was water and coffee, and I feel better. Absolutely, I even feel better the next day when I wake up on days that I do a little bit of fasting, which is obviously popular in the press. But I want to come back to some of the other things, but let's just talk about this fasting thing for a moment, because another concept in your book, which I find very, very interesting personally, is the idea of stressing your body to help you not only be healthier, but age better. And so this notion of fasting, you're actually stressing your body. But you have done a lot of research as to why that's a positive, not only in humans, but I think you've done the research in plants as well.
Right, we have. First of all, I just want to clarify, we're not talking about mental stress. That's the same word, different concept. You do not want to stress your mind. But we're talking about biological stress, which you think of it as tricking your body into thinking that there's a threat to survival, giving the body some adversity. This is the way we evolved. We were not sitting around in front of computer screens all day. We were hungry, and we were running a lot to catch our food, or at least walking a lot. And this is what our body needs to trigger its natural defenses against those scratches and other causes of aging. And so we've learned from studying yeast cells all the way through to humans is that being a little hungry or exercising triggers a set of genes that there are certain families. There are ones called sirtuins that I study. There's AMPK, which responds to energy, and there's one called mTOR that responds to protein intake. When you fast, you trigger these defensive pathways, these genetic pathways that defend our bodies. Now, we don't know exactly all of the things they do to make life longer, at least in mice, probably humans, but we know enough to say that they address many of these 9 causes of aging, including the scratches.
Yeah, it's actually, it's just fascinating. And when you think about the notion of putting yourself under stress to be healthier, it's incredible. And even things like, at some level, and something near and dear to our heart, even exercise is a form of stress, correct?
Well, it is. Yeah, your body will want to save energy, and so your muscles will lose size, and we all know this happens. And it's because our bodies, when there's a lot of food and not a lot of need for walking or exercise, will default to basically, being an astronaut. It'll lose its ability to fight problems when they occur, and that includes infection, right? Which is really important. But I want to get back, John, to what you asked me about or suggested I expand upon about the plant stress, because that's a really interesting one. We discovered many years ago now that the activation of these sirtuin defenses, which actually, by the way, control the epigenome in the scratches, they get activated by plant molecules, one of which is resveratrol from grapes, and it's found in red wine as well. And resveratrol is produced by plants that are adversity, either lack of water or fungal infection or insects chewing it. We came up with this hypothesis. The name is xenohormesis, which is a mouthful, but basically it means that when plants are stressed, they make these defense molecules for their own benefit to survive, turn on their sirtuin defenses. And we actually know that that's true. Plants will turn on these genes and make more resveratrol. And the idea is that when we eat those plants that have been stressed out, our bodies get a signal that our food supply might be running low. And maybe that's the reason that the Mediterranean diet is so healthy, is that it's full of relatively stressed plants. And most recently, a molecule was discovered to activate SIRT1 that comes from olive oil. It's called oleic acid. You find it in avocados as well. And our bodies make that same fatty acid when we're hungry. The breakdown of fat in our bodies makes oleic acid, which may be the reason, or one of the reasons, why fasting is healthy.
Yeah. Do you have a particular meal you skip each day, or do you vary it depending upon the day?
Usually I skip breakfast because I'm not that hungry. But everyone's different, right? Some people can't survive without their morning breakfast. But yeah, it's usually, so my day is a cup of tea or a cup of coffee in the morning. Usually I'm just too busy to eat at lunch. I might grab a piece of fruit or something like that. But then I don't eat till late afternoon or dinner. My downfall, I'm not as strict as you might imagine. My downfall is eating after dinner. I really try not to do that, but it's tempting, when you're sitting down and trying to de-stress from the day to grab a snack or two. But that's not a good thing either, because you also want to use the period of sleep as part of that fasting.
Yeah, that's why missing the breakfast tends to be a popular one. I know to the extent I take a day here and there where I do some fasting, it's like today for me, for instance, it's breakfast I skip. You can stop eating at 7, 8 o'clock at night, and by the time you eat at noon the next day, you've had a pretty long fast, which I think you would have a better sense than me, but I've heard everything from 10 to 16 hours of fasting can have a positive impact. I don't know if that's the right range or not, but what would you suggest if someone wanted to take you up on this idea of fasting and putting your body under a little stress? What would be the right time frame to refrain from food?
Well, there's a popular method called the 16-8, which you mentioned. 8 hours of eating, or at least having some glucose spike in your blood. Um, yeah, I think that one is reasonable. Everybody's different though. I would start with skipping one meal and see how you go. Hot water or tea, coffee are good. A little bit of it's not going to hurt in your coffee, I don't believe. I've been monitoring myself occasionally, looking at my blood glucose levels, and what works for me is that stretch from about 8 o'clock through to late lunch. But that's a lot. I wouldn't try to do that the first day unless you've got really great willpower. Just start small, skip a meal, see how you feel, do it every other day. But one thing that I think is something to try to avoid is the snacks. We certainly when you're middle-aged like I am at 50, but even earlier, 3 full meals with snacks, unless you're an athlete who's burning a ton of calories, you don't need that many calories. And you'll know because you're starting to put on weight and people struggle. So I think it's also the snacks. It's pretty, a bit of fruit isn't so bad, but those high energy bars, I think, if you can try to avoid those,
Yeah.
as long as you're not in calorie deficit, that's also something to look at in your diet.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen a lot of athletes, and I had a stretch in my life where I was very active with long distance bike riding and mountain bike racing and things like that. And you get into a groove where, you're eating Cliff Bars and you're eating all these different things, and they're 300, 400, 500 calories and they're basically carb bombs. That works great when you're doing that, but then when you develop that habit and you stop riding your bike 3 hours a day or 4 hours a day, you're still, that's
Right.
not a recipe for success.
For sure. And actually, one of the things that I did that I don't regret is to skip eating desserts, certainly at restaurants, but even at home. Try not to go crazy on ice cream and stuff like that. And so that's not a hard rule, but it's certainly something I try my best to stick to. And I started at age 40 and have no regrets about doing that.
Yeah, good for you. Before we move on from fasting, I want to make sure I heard you right. I don't know that I did. So you're drinking your tea and your coffee in the morning while you're fasted. Do you put any cream or anything in your coffee or tea? Or for someone that might only like coffee with cream, does that mess up the fast, putting a little bit of cream in there? Or what would you suggest to those people?
Well, there's been a fair bit of debate about this. My view about life is, if you're so strict that you don't want to put a little bit of milk in your coffee, then life's not worth living. So I'm fine with a bit of milk. It's not a bunch of cream and sugar, but it's a little bit of milk just for the taste. And I've measured my blood sugar levels during that, and I do that because I think that's a very good indicator of whether you're in a non-fasted or fasted state. And a little bit of milk's not going to hurt, especially if it makes your day more enjoyable and you stick to the diet. That's the other thing. It's, if you're too strict with any diet, it's just hard to continue.
Yeah, and I think that the ability to stick with something over time, the consistency, makes a big difference. Speaking of consistency, and I know you've done this for a while, so you have well exercised your fasting discipline muscles. But for someone who hasn't done it before, since you think it's a tool that people can use, do I need to do it every day? Can I do it a couple times a week? Do I do it a couple times a month? What would you recommend?
Well, I'm trying to think about the data. It's always based on studies.
Yeah, facts.
I'm not sure it's been studied enough to be able to say that. What I would guess is that a little bit is better than nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you feel like doing it for a few days a week, that's going to still be beneficial. It may not be as good as doing it 5 days a week, but to be factual about it, there haven't been enough studies comparing these various diets in humans and in mice. It could be quite different. And in mice, they tend to just force the mice 7 days a week to do something because they don't object. But everyone's different. John, I cannot emphasize enough that what works for some doesn't work for others. And what's important is to measure whether it's working or not. What I do is I measure things. I've got this wristband, there's an Aura ring.
Yeah.
I occasionally do blood tests as well to see how I'm doing. If you're really interested, you can ask your doctor for a prescription for a blood glucose monitor to see what foods cause you to spike in glucose versus not. Grapes are really bad in my body. But yeah, I mean, to address your question really directly, I think if you can do it for a few days a week, it's going to be beneficial. There are some extreme examples, though. There are some people who fast for a whole week, which I've never been able to do. But that's really at the extremes. And it's still unclear whether that's more beneficial than doing it the way I do it.
Yeah, well, plus I think the reality of it is in 2021, we live in a world where food is part of the culture, right? And I think if you got to fast for a whole week, you're, like you said before, you're missing out on a little bit of the fun in life sometimes. So to do that regularly, I think would be very hard. Talk a little bit about sleep. Now, there's the idea of using fasting as a tool and lever to help you with the aging process. Sleep, from what I know of it, is a great recovery tool and a great way for your body to rebuild. But as I listen to you talk about hormesis and stress and things like that, sleep doesn't seem very stressful. So it seems like the other end of the spectrum. But from what I know, it's a very necessary part of biology.
Yeah, it certainly is. And the systems that defend the body, such as the sirtuins that I've mentioned that we work on, they are intimately linked, in fact, control the body's clock. So you've got these cycles in your body that actually exist in your brain and separate from your liver. And when your organs get out of sync, you feel jet lagged. And this can happen whether you travel or you stay up late. This has been shown, at least in the lab, to be very deleterious. I think all of us who used to travel a lot are not missing it. And it's a good thing that we're not traveling as much through time zones. You can disrupt those cycles in a mouse and it will have signs of accelerated aging. And there was just a recent study, albeit in a worm. No, I think it was a fly, John, I want to correct that. But what they found was that the effects of fasting on lifespan extension only worked when the clock was working. If you disrupt that 24-hour cycle, the flies didn't live longer. And so what that tells you is that you need the clock to be in sync for all of this seemingly to work, at least if you're a fly. But given what I know about our bodies, I think it's probably true as well. I mean, one of the reasons that I'm not as articulate today as I sometimes am is I got a bad night's sleep. Our son slept in our bed last night. So I only got a few hours sleep.
Those days are hard. Those days are hard.
Right. So it's not just bad for your ability to think. Over the long run, if you're not getting enough sleep or regular sleep, I think it likely will accelerate the aging process as well.
Yeah, I sympathize with you a little bit because I also had a night a couple nights ago. I don't think I slept more than 2 hours. And I tell you what, that next day, it was just, the whole day was painful. Just everything about it was painful. And I have no explanation for why I didn't sleep that night. And then, the next night I was fortunate. I had a great night of sleep and, I woke up and I came out breathing fire and felt great all day. So I think we all know firsthand the value of sleep, but it's interesting to hear from your perspective, and that circadian rhythm really is what you're talking about, right?
It is.
Yeah,
it is. And again, the measurement. So the Aura ring, I've no benefit of mentioning the name, but I think it's a really interesting device. I don't know if John, you've got one.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with it. Yep.
Yeah. Well, for those of you listening or watching who haven't tried it, it's one of the devices, there are many, that can measure sleep. And so I can look at my phone and look at my sleep patterns over the last week, month, year, and see how I'm doing, as well as my heart rate, movement. And I learn things about myself, about what works, how I'm doing. Am I starting to stress out? Am I getting enough sleep? And it even tells you the levels of sleep, if you get into very deep sleep or not. And I've also learned the kind of things that I can do in my life to get that deep sleep. May sound obvious, but a glass of wine late at night really does affect my ability to get into that deep sleep.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too. I'll just go back to what you were talking about a moment ago. There you were talking about resveratrol, and obviously part of it, obviously derived from grapes and things like that and whatnot. You like grapes, but grapes make your blood sugar spike. I had a similar experience. I was monitoring myself, and
probably no surprise, but I had some sushi, and the sushi had some rice, and I knew, I know enough about this stuff. I know white rice can spike, but when you actually look at the data and you see how much your blood sugar spikes with just a little rice from a sushi roll versus sashimi, it's like, I haven't had a sushi roll since. Still like them a lot, but it's amazing how everyone's body is obviously a little bit different. It's really
That's exactly right. And you have to learn it for yourself. Yeah. And I have the same problem with white rice and sushi. I love it. I used to eat sushi almost every day. Can you believe that? Thinking it was the best meal for me at the cafeteria at Harvard. Who knows what I've been doing to my body.
That's right. Well, one of the things I love about you is for all your accomplishments as a scientist and everything that you research, you're still very real. Like you're like the rest of us. Sometimes you want that sushi, sometimes you want a grape. You know what it's going to do, but but you're okay with it every once in a while. I think that's the reality for most people.
Right. Yeah, some people think that I'm a nut who wants to live forever. That's not the case. I'm curious, and I want everyone to be as healthy as possible. And if I can learn a little bit by self-experimenting, then I'll do that.
Yeah. So what about food and this notion of plant-based? And I think that definition, the definition of plant-based has been a little bit bastardized. Who knows really what it means to people anymore? But what's your perception of a balanced diet based on what you know?
Yeah. Well, there's two schools of thought. One is that you should avoid meat. And the evidence for that mainly is that one longevity pathway called mTOR is best for animals, at least when there's low amounts of protein. The other school of thought is that we want a lot of protein because it's good for our muscles and good for a variety of things, at least in the short term. I fall somewhere in between. And in part, it's because I go to the gym and I work out, and I found that it makes a big difference whether I have some animal meat, animal protein or not. And so what I try to do in my life, just to use an example, not because I want to always talk about myself, but it's probably the best illustration. I'm an average person. I spend too much time in front of a computer. I don't get a lot of time for exercise. When I do, I'm at the gym for maybe an hour. On days like that, I will, I'll have some meat. I do try to not have so much red meat for reasons that I think most of us know. There's trends, at least for processed meat, but red meat in general towards cancer and heart disease in the very long run. But, I think having a bit of meat's fine. But I like to, here's a confession. If I had a choice, I would just eat meat and flavor it with vegetables. I'm really a carnivore, but so I have to force myself to, if I have a meal, the majority of that meal will be vegetables. And then I'll have fruit over a meat as a sandwich snack. But I don't enjoy it as much as eating a big steak. I'm Australian. I grew up on steak, burnt steak. So again, who knows what damage that did. But yeah, I don't like getting into the war where it should be all plants or it should be all meat. I think though, we have enough partisanship in politics. We don't need it in the nutritional world. But I do think that eating a fair amount of plants, especially fresh plants, not overcooked and not canned vegetables, is healthy. And we know that because people in places where they live a long time tend to eat those kinds of foods.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that. And whatever is beyond type A, I don't know if it's like type A plus, type AA plus, whatever, that tends to be my personal bias. And I get a little too into things. And my mother always has said to me, all things in moderation. So, when I listen to you talk about that, it reminds me of what my mother used to tell me. And so I think if you can find some balance, like anything else in life, right? It's okay to eat meat sometimes. Makes sense.
Oh.
Yeah.
Sure.
Tell me a little bit about your latest research. I've had the benefit for our listeners. I've been able to visit David in his lab, and it's truly amazing. A lot of the work you do is in mice. And I think you have a new article that was just published in Nature on a study you did. Can you talk about that for a moment? Because I think that's interesting and kind of where we're headed in the future of aging.
Right. So just to set the stage for this, About 5 years ago, I started saying the phrase age reversal. And it got a lot of people upset because they just weren't used to it, I think. And it seemed like it was science fiction. Now, age reversal is actually one of the hottest areas of biology. And so we've come a long way just recently. And so the kind of discoveries that we're making in the lab, and one of them we've just published, as you mentioned, these are the kind of discoveries that I didn't imagine I would see in my lifetime. So that's how excited I am about this. So what am I talking about? This is new technology. Some of it's in my lab. There's maybe 5 labs in the world that do the same thing. We're talking about technology to polish the scratches on the CD. And what we didn't know, if we did that, if we polished the CD, is the music still there or has it been lost? And I would bet that most people would say, well, even if you polish those scratches, the cells won't be young and you won't suddenly become youthful, because how would the cell know what the state was when we were young? Remember, you've got those loops and bundles at the DNA level. How does a cell know what those loops and bundles used to be when you were 20? To be honest, we still don't know how the cell records that information, but we do know that the cells do have a memory of the original music of our lives and the ability to read the right genes or songs at the right time. And so what we published specifically was that we found a gene therapy, in other words, a combination of 3 genes that are called Yamanaka factors. Yamanaka is a scientist from Japan who won the Nobel Prize in 2016 for discovering that a certain set of genes from embryos, that are switched on in embryos, can be used to make stem cells out of adults. So I could take, John, your skin cell and program it or reprogram it to be a pluripotent stem cell that I could then grow skin, little brains, or put those back into your body and rebuild tissue. And that was well deserving of a Nobel Prize. But what we did was we said, okay, can you partially reprogram a cell to be young again, but not so young that it becomes a stem cell, because that would be a disaster. You'd have cancer, you'd have a whole problem. You wouldn't fix the problem. And so we tried it in skin cells, and we found a combination of 3 genes that worked to make cells younger, but not too young. And then we tried it in a mouse that had lost its vision because it was old. And mice after a year basically are blind in the lab. And we gave the genes in a virus to the eye, a gene therapy that's used in genetic diseases in humans right now. So this isn't crazy technology. It's not far-fetched that this could work in humans. And then we turned on those 3 Yamanaka genes in the mouse's eye for 3 weeks, and something incredible happened. The eyes worked again, and the mice could see again as though they were young again. And then when we measured the age of the nerve cells at the back of the eye, they weren't just behaving as though they were young, they literally were young again. And so that brings up the possibility that we might be able to reprogram and make other parts of the body young again. And so I think your next question might be, how long till we can
I was going to say, can we cure aging? Yeah. You knew where I was going.
I don't know about curing aging. I think that's something a bit beyond anything that I'm capable of doing. But I think reversing aging in the eye and other parts of the body is going to happen within our lifetime. There's now a lot more scientists interested in this work just in the last 6 months. So there's a push to get this research into humans. I'm working with a group that wants to try to treat glaucoma, pressure-induced damage to the retina. And if we're right, we should be able to restore vision in those patients. And from there, then we'll tackle things like macular degeneration and maybe even just blindness from old age. And then ultimately, you could eventually have one injection and you take an antibiotic that turns on these genes. That's how we do it in the mouse. We just give them an antibiotic that turns on the genes. And then you get reversed in age. We'll see. There's a long way to go before that. I don't want to promise that we can make a 50-year-old or an 80-year-old go back to 20, but at least we know that there's something in our cells that allows us to press the reset button and polish those scratches. And 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, we didn't know that that was possible.
Yeah, and it's amazing listening to you. And again, just having had the good fortune and benefit over the last couple of years of visiting your lab and seeing what you do, just knowing even a few years ago, you had the persistence and conviction that you know that you'd eventually get to the point where you thought you'd be able to reverse it, and then you ended up doing it with these mice eyes. It's incredible to have even had a 3 steps removed view of it, knowing you a bit. I'm not one that reads science journals, but I'm looking forward to when the press picks up on it and shares your story about this research a little bit more, because it's truly fascinating, really, really amazing. So for our listeners who are on this journey of health and discovery, and I think probably listening very intently to tips from you on how they can slow down the aging process, if you will. Do you have any thoughts as well on things in your research which would help with immunity, which is a very, very big topic in this day and age? I know something you got very passionate about in 2020 relative to the COVID pandemic. Are there things that you've learned in your research which can help with immunity? And then follow-up question to that, is there any connection to things you've learned with aging? So is there any connections between the things that help with immunity and help with slowing aging?
Well, the simple answer is yes. At a high level, if we stayed younger biologically, we wouldn't have this pandemic, right? That's probably stating the obvious, but it should be stated. And things that drive aging are obesity, lack of exercise, eating the wrong types of foods. And those people that have not looked after their bodies the latter half of their lives are now much more predisposed to dying from this infection. So again, if it wasn't a motivator already to live healthy, the fact that we now have a pandemic and that there will be another one, certainly when many of us get older, there'll be something else that comes along, I'm quite sure of it. We want to be ready for that as well. But specifically, the answer is yes, that aging research does pertain to immunity. So I mentioned mTOR, the protein sensing pathway. There's some good evidence, even from human studies, that pathway, when you trigger it, actually when you inhibit it, to be more specific, you can boost immunity. And though there was a recent clinical trial that failed, I think the basic biology and the actual process is very valid. And so that's one example. In my world, we study the sirtuins, and they use this molecule called NAD in the body, which goes down as we age, and we can boost it up with precursor molecules to NAD. And NAD is just a small molecule that we make that runs metabolism, but also the body senses NAD levels and uses it to turn on our body's defenses. Now, I don't want to sound like someone with a nail looking for a hammer. I was just looking to explain science during 2020. But what happened during 2020 was that there were other people besides me coming out with evidence that NAD levels control immunity. And in fact, if you have higher NAD levels, it's better. And what's even scarier is that COVID-19, the virus, depletes NAD. So if you're old and you have low NAD levels and you get hit by the virus, you'll have maybe an even greater deficit of NAD that would disable your body's ability to fight the infection. And it actually, we now know from more research that one of the ways that the virus attacks the body and wins is by depleting levels of NAD. So it's actually attacking us at our core. So we actually have, I'm working with a group that's doing studies in patients that have come in with COVID-19 to see if raising their NAD levels will help them. And it's really too early to say for sure, but the initial results in, it's 20 or so patients look promising.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I know I highly recommend, and we sell it in our centers, your book, Lifespan, which you wrote, which is incredible. And to your point of NAD, you follow, I think, a certain protocol, certain supplements and things that you do that you think have a positive impact on it. But I think maybe more importantly, you have your father on the protocol. And I know you've shared with me some stories about your father. I'd love to get an update on Dad. How's he doing?
Well, he's now a year older since we last talked. He's 81. And recall, most 81-year-old men are below ground at this point.
Yeah.
So he has no diseases, no aches or pains, and is really running out of people who can keep up with him. Unfortunately, he does a lot of exercise and has done so since he was 40, actually late 30s. So he's led the life that we've talked about. Exercise. He's watched his weight. Not as rigorously as we were talking about today, but he didn't overeat. He would skip breakfast most days, and I think is benefiting now in his life. Now, we don't know. I'm a Harvard professor, so I'm not saying that this is proof that it's working, but it's a beacon of hope, and I'm very proud of him, how he's doing in his health. And to be 81 with he's stronger than me, he's fitter than me. We've tested this; it's a fact. His mind is, just as good as it was when he was 30, which he claims means he didn't have a very good mind when he was 30. Someone like that, I think, we should all try to strive to be like that. And what it bodes well for, touch wood, knock on wood for him, is that he will stay healthy for another 5 or 10 years, which is really the point. We're not talking about keeping people older for longer. We're talking about slowing down the rate of diseases and prolonging the health period of life. And then hopefully when we pass away, and we all will pass away, unfortunately, it'll happen relatively quickly. And we know that the longer you live, the faster you die, and the less burden you are on your family and the economy.
Yeah, there's that notion of health span, right? Which people talk about, and staying healthier longer. As you think about the future for David Sinclair and your research, I know reversing aging sounds like it's a very big part of your research, but beyond that, anything else that you're focused on, sort of in the what's next categories? I know you're naturally inquisitive, so I'm sure you're thinking about what else is out there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So we're trying to understand what drives that ticking of the clock in more detail than just the ping pong game, what's really going on. And how does that reversal process happen? Where is that store of information that allows cells to reset the system? And we don't know. It could be a chemical on the DNA. It could be some other process that we don't even know about, or maybe can't even imagine at this point. So we definitely want to understand why it happens and how it all works. And the reason for that is, once you understand how something works, you can now intervene. And although we've made this discovery where we can reverse vision loss and perhaps one day reverse the age of a lot of organs, it's still a gene therapy, which means it's expensive and it's difficult. What I want to do is understand how this works and put it in a cheap pill that everybody could take or rub on their skin or do whatever. And so that's the future, is a cheap version of what we're working on now.
Yeah, it's incredible the work you do. And I think I will tell you, in this day and age too, one of the things I love about your research and how you translate it to people like me and probably a lot of our listeners is the notion that the choices you make and some of the lifestyle decisions you make, you can actually have an impact. Your destiny is not predetermined entirely by your genetics. You can actually impact your epigenome and make a difference.
Well, people who I talk to, and I talk to a lot of people about this, there's a large group, the majority of people, who don't bother doing anything about their age or their trajectory, primarily because they don't realize what an impact they can have. And when I explain that 80% of their health and longevity is epigenetic and not genetic, it makes a big difference, because majority of what our health is in old age is in our own hands. And it's important. And you cannot begin to do this when you're 80. It's too late to reverse a lot of that change. Maybe gene therapy notwithstanding, we need to start early. And so I'm not saying people in their 20s need to worry, and certainly not teenagers who have enough problems with food and consumption.
Yeah.
I think, and we're not talking about malnutrition or anything like that, but those who are 30 and above, who are not exercising like crazy, these kind of things can have a massive difference later in life. One statistic, John, is that those who exercise, ride bicycles a few times a week, their chance of getting a lethal disease in old age is reduced by 40%. That's massive. That's bigger than anything that we know of in the pharmaceutical world.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before we wrap up, I'll just share, like you said, riding a bike. I think sometimes there's simple things, even walking. My kids maybe get a dog 5 years ago, and although they told me it was going to be their dog, it ended up being my dog. So, well, aside from the love and affection of a dog, the other thing is I walk a lot more. So the dog and I walk. Sometimes we go early in the morning, sometimes we go at night, we go on the weekends. And I think for people to even understand, you talk about exercise, whether it's riding a bike or even walking for some people can be exercise. So it can be as simple as that for many people. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, sum it up in one word. It's move. Just move.
Yeah.
And I'm guilty of sitting for too much. I have a standing desk right here, which is helping maintain my core muscles. And those are really important to maintain, especially as you get older. One of the largest causes of death is falling over and breaking a hip. And so what you want to do is be able to fall over and bounce back up. And the way to do that is to do the strength training as well. We haven't talked a bit about that, but that's what I do. I do hip hinges, I do deadlifts, back exercises, as well as my arms, so I don't look like, a super wimp. But those core exercises, really important the older you get, and especially men, but also women, we're losing muscle strength the older we get, especially once you're my age and older.
Yeah, I tell you, when I read your book, and again, the book's called Lifespan for the listeners, you talk in one point about the book about, I forget the exact name of it, but the test where you stand up off the floor as a predictor of things and all this. And I put the book down, you appreciate, you know me a little bit. I put the book down like mid-sentence and I got down on the floor. I said, okay, let's see what happens. So I passed. Last year I passed. So I'll do it again maybe this year and see what happens. So I think that movement is important.
For sure. And that's testing the muscles that are in your pelvis, which are the key ones. I have to say, I'm getting to the point where I struggle to go from cross legs to immediately get up. But it's a good reminder that we're all aging, no matter what we do, but we can change that trajectory, and that's the key.
Yeah, you can make an impact. So obviously, your book is a great place for people to learn more, learn about you, Lifespan. Where else can our listeners go to learn more about what you're doing, David, and keep up with you?
Well, the website is called Lifespan Book, lifespanbook.com. And I've got some blogs and a newsletter you can subscribe to. I talk about new scientific findings and my mental ponderings on Twitter occasionally. So that's David A. Sinclair. And so those are the main two outlets of my work. If you're into the science, you can find our lab's research online, and other people have written about our research. So that's another way to dig in as well if you want to get into the nitty-gritty.
Excellent. Well, I always enjoy talking with you. Thank you for sharing your story with us today. Great having you on.
Thanks, John. It's always a pleasure.